As I am sure most of you are aware, hideous and barbaric violence has recently broken out in Israel and Palestine. Hamas recently launched a brutal assault on Israel. Many of the victims of this assault were civilians who were brutally slaughtered by Hamas. Hamas eagerly slaughtered enormous numbers of civilians. Naturally, Israel responded to this with their own inhumanity and depravity. Israel has deprived Gaza of access to food, water, and electricity, and has been subjecting the city to frequent aerial bombardment. Gaza is of course populated largely by children, given the appallingly low life expectancy there. Both the political left and the political right have descended into barbaric savagery. Legions of leftists have endorsed the murderous Islamist organization that is Hamas. Legions of rightoids have endorsed brutal Israeli retaliation, and by extension, the enormous amount of death and suffering that will accompany it. Many care about mindless tribalism more than standing by their principles. Many are currently making claims that are objectively in support of the slaughter of civilians. But what do I make of this? Firstly, Hamas is an evil and depraved radical Islamist organization. Hamas is a bloodthirsty organization that is more interested in murdering Jews than freeing Palestine. Hamas is not a liberation movement. Hamas is an organization of Islamic extremists who could not care less about freedom and liberty. There is nothing progressive or left-wing about Hamas. They are depraved Islamic fundamentalists who eagerly slaughter civilians. If they ever liberated Palestine, they would subject it to their own brutal Islamist repression, as they already do in Gaza. Hamas is not the friend of the left. Hamas is not the friend of progressivism. Hamas is a murderous Islamist organization. Hamas is not Palestine. Palestine deserves better than the bloodthirsty cruelty and rampant sadism of Hamas. It is also the case that the Israeli authorities are far from morally righteous. In fact, that is an understatement. The Israeli authorities are morally depraved. The Israeli government has been engaged in a long-standing campaign of ethnic cleansing. The Israeli government's response to the attack is itself totally murderous and will result in an enormous amount of death and suffering in Gaza. This death and suffering will not be limited to Hamas. This death and suffering will be faced by the people of Gaza, many of whom are children, and many of whom do not support Hamas. Hamas is evil, but that does not make the Israeli government good. The Israeli government and Hamas both enjoy senseless violence and slaughtering countless civilians. If you are opposed to senseless violence and the slaughter of countless civilians, then both Hamas and the Israeli government are your enemy. If you oppose cruelty and brutality, you have no team here. And cruelty and brutality is our enemy. A society that opposes suffering is in the interest of one who can suffer. This is not a complicated maxim. The discourse surrounding the recent brutality has suffered from the expected lack of nuance and mindless idiocy. If you oppose the senseless violence of Hamas, you should also oppose the senseless violence of the Israeli government. If you oppose the senseless violence of the Israeli government, you should also oppose the senseless violence of Hamas. This is not complicated. The irony. Out of outrage at the sight of civilians being killed, people begin calling for the killing of civilians. Depravity is a disease, and never has a disease been so contagious. This issue has become ground zero for the ultimate bad take competition between the political right and the political left. The mutual depravity on display is stunning. Rarely are so many people so openly depraved. I expect depravity from the political right, but it always disappoints me when I see it from the left. Unfortunately, I am routinely disappointed. The left-wing support for the Hamas attack was, however, some of the greatest disappointment I have felt in a while. The great irony is that if you support Hamas, you are in no position to condemn Israel. If the senseless slaughter of countless civilians is defensible, then how is Israel worthy of condemnation? The same thing can of course be said to the political right. How can you look down on the senseless cruelty of Hamas only to endorse the senseless cruelty of Israel moments later? How can you be so enraged by conduct that you support? How can you criticize moral depravity when you are yourself morally depraved? It is crucial that we frame this conflict not as some kind of ethnic race war between Israel and Palestine, but instead as what it is, a conflict between Hamas and the Israeli government. Such a war should not be framed as a clash of people, as this portrays all people as legitimate targets. It assigns innocent civilians the role of combatants by portraying the teams as ethnic. This is a falsity, and a dangerous one. The people of Palestine and the people of Israel are not enemies. The enemy of both peoples are the Israeli government and Hamas, both of which incessantly raise tensions, encourage conflict, and engage in senseless violence. Something else that frustrates me is the tendency for Western sources to treat the evil Hamas attack as some kind of random act of terrorism, when the attack occurs within a long-standing conflict. The attack must be understood within the context of a long-standing conflict. Not because this excuses the attack, but because it makes it easier for us to understand its causes and prevent it from occurring again. The attack must be understood as part of a context of a long-standing conflict. The attack must be understood as occurring against the backdrop of Israeli government-pushed ethnic cleansing and mutual ideological extremism. Only by understanding the context from which the recent depravity has emerged can we prevent it from occurring again. Pretending that the Hamas attack was a random act of terror is idiotic, and serves to aid such evil by obscuring the causes, the identification of which is essential to the prevention of such actions. The bloodthirsty takes need to stop. The bloodthirsty takes on either side contribute to the situation of desensitization, normalized cruelty, dehumanization, undermined respect for sentience, and corroded empathy and compassion that makes the cruelty on both sides possible. The hideous depraved takes contributes to an environment of normalized depravity, desensitization, dehumanization, and corroded empathy and compassion that facilitates the evils committed by both Hamas and the Israeli government. The same thing is true of the attacks themselves. The senseless violence of the Hamas attack and the Israeli response serve only to create conditions of desensitization, dehumanization, normalized depravity, and corroded compassion that will facilitate more violence for many years to come. The solution to a bloodthirsty attack by your opponents is not to desensitize them to cruelty even further by slaughtering children. This will only serve to ease their next inhumanity by normalizing cruelty and undermining respect for sentience further. The Israeli government has no interest in a moral high ground, only in partaking in a senseless and never-ending exchange of senseless violence with Hamas. Both the extremists of the Israeli government and the extremists of Hamas find in this exchange the perfect justification for cementing their authority and following their extremist agendas. They both benefit from senseless violence, while innocents on both sides pay the price. Hamas and the Israeli government are the enemy of both the Palestinian and Israeli peoples. It should also be remembered that Israel's increasingly vicious military response is only going to empower Hamas. Nothing serves Hamas recruitment better than Israeli war crimes. When Israel massacres civilians, people will move towards extremism. People will move towards Hamas. People who lose loved ones to Israeli military action will naturally gravitate towards vicious and depraved anti-Israeli extremism. The solution to the Israel-Palestine situation is not senseless cruelty and wanton violence. The solution to the Israel-Palestine situation is humanitarianism, de-escalation, diplomacy, and a two-state solution. The recent actions of both Hamas and the Israeli government are a rejection of these noble goals.